Alrighty guys, today we are going to go through the importance of seeds. So a seed is made up of a plant's embryo and a food supply surrounded by a protective covering. The earliest fossils of plants with seeds are from about 360 million years ago. They're pretty old. Unlike moss and ferns, seed plants do not need standing water for the fertilization of their gametes, so the sperm are not swimming through any kind of water. Adaptations are going to allow seed plants to reproduce by transferring the pollen. Cones and flowers. In seed plants, the dominant stage is a sporophyte. Gametophytes develop in cones or flowers. Seed plants are divided into two groups. We have the Gymnosperms, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, and Angiosperms, which we'll hit in about 2 weeks. Gymnosperms produce cones. Angiosperms are going to be the flowering plants. So if we're looking at our origin of plants down here, we have our small plants, our mosses, ferns, that sort of thing. And then we get off here, we have our seed plants are going to start appearing, we have our gymnosperms, and the angiosperms are kind of the most recent plants that we have. So with pollen, the entire male gametophyte is contained in a tiny structure called the pollen grain. Pollen produces sperm, and they do not swim through water to fertilize the eggs like I mentioned. Instead, they must be carried to the female structure. So whether this is better or worse, it's kind of dependent upon the environment that they live in. Pollination is the actual act of transferring male reproductive structures to the female structures. I need to move this. There we go. Put it all the way up here in this little corner. Okay. So after fertilization, the zygote in a seed is going to grow into this tiny plant, which we call the embryo. The embryo is diploid and often stops growing while it is still small and contained within the seed. And it stops growing can be for weeks, for months, or even years. It just depends on how long the dormant period is. A seed coat is going to surround and protect the embryo, and it's basically going to keep the embryo from drying out, and it'll allow it to stay dormant until conditions are favorable. The embryo is going to use the nutrients from the food supply in the seed until it can carry out photosynthesis on its own. So during this dormant period, it's not going to be active, it's not going to be growing, it's just kind of chilling in there. And you notice this a lot, during the winter months. Plants may have went to seed at the end of the fall, and there's no new plants growing because it's so cold. But come spring, that's when everything pops up again. So this is what a seed basically would look like. You have the seed coat around the outside, the plumule, which is going to be these little leaves here, the hypocotyl radical axis, the hilum, the micropyle, and the cotyledon is in here. And then here you can see it again a little bit. We have the seed coat, which is going to end up popping off, and that's going to give rise to these cotyledon, which we tend to call the seed leaves. And when those open up, you have the actual foliage leaves. For seed structure, you have the concave side of an ordinary kidney bean. It has a small white scar called the hilum. I use kidney beans because it's the easiest one to see that hilum on. Once the bean is placed into water, it's going to swell up, and it's going to split the seed coat, revealing two halves called the cotyledons. The cotyledon is going to be the food storage organs that function as the seed leaves. The plumule is the embryo shoot. The epicotyl is a stem located above the cotyledon. The hypocotyl is the stem located below the cotyledon, and the tip of the stem will develop into the radicle. The plumule and the radicle are enclosed in a tubular sheathing structures called the, and I'm really bad at pronouncing these words, colopetyle and the coloraza. These protect the delicate tissues with the seeds as they germinate. So we go through germination. It's going to be the beginning or the continuation of the growth of the seed, depending on where it stopped and went into its dormant stage. The seed must be viable. Many seeds require a dormant period before they will germinate. Fruit trees, like apples or pears or peaches, require that the seed be removed and washed before it will germinate. So you're thinking, how on earth do we get new apple and pear trees if you actually have to have someone take it out and wash it? These seeds will not germinate after the fruit has dropped until the embryo has fully developed with the aid of food materials stored in its endosperm. So this is known as the after ripening stage. So this is whenever you wouldn't eat the fruit, you'd probably think it's pretty disgusting, but as far as, seeds go, they think this is actually good. That's where they want their fruit to get. Woody plants living in temperate areas will not germinate until the seed experiences a wet period followed by a cold period, and it needs to be a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks. So trees for us, maybe oak trees or maple trees, they like, that fall period where everything gets really rainy, really wet, and then winter comes, it gets really cold, and then things start to heat back up again. The trees actually like that. Fruit and seed dispersal happens by wind. There's adaptations that help with wind dispersal. The samara of a maple has a curved wing that causes the fruit to spin as it's released from the tree. You've probably seen these all over the ground before. I remember being a child running around, and we called them helicopters. We'd pick them up and spin them and see how fast we could make them go. Dandelion seeds have blooms, and they allow the seed to be carried away. So if you ever were outside and you kicked dandelions, or maybe you picked them up and you blew them, and your parents were probably thinking, oh my gosh, now we're going to have dandelions all over the yard. At least that's what my dad was always thinking, but that didn't stop me from blowing on dandelions anyways. You can also have dispersal by animals. So it can be birds or mammals and ants. They all act as disseminating agents. Some seeds are going to adhere to the feet of the animal, while others are designed to be eaten and then released elsewhere. So we have burrs. Burrs are actually different types of seeds, and they used to get stuck in cat fur, dog fur. They attach themselves to deer. I remember going sled riding with one of my really good friends many, many years ago, and we went down over this hill. We'd never been over the hill before, and we ended up getting stuck in a burr bush, and I came out with a few in my hair, but her hair was matted with burrs, and her mom had a fit trying to get all those out. Other seeds that are going to be eaten, like this little red bush here, has little beans that can be eaten, and then the bird is supposed to get rid of that by defecating, and that will allow the seed to be released somewhere else. There's also dispersal by water. Some fruits contain air trapped that allows them to float to a new location, and they call these guys floaters. You've probably seen, coconuts. They are actually seeds, and they just float along. They don't sink in the water. Or lotus flowers, they also have air pockets. Now, gymnosperms, that's the first type of plant we're going to talk about. It means naked seed. And that's because you can actually see the seed here. The pine cones are the seeds. It comes from the fact that the seeds of gymnosperms are exposed on the scales in their cones. The most common ones are conifers, but it also includes the cycads, which would be something that looks like this, and the ginkgos, which is this. They have these big, large, flat leaves. They're kind of shaped like hearts, I think. So gymnosperms have two kinds of cones. They have pollen cones and seed cones. Pollen cones are going to be the male cones, and they produce tiny little grains, and each tiny pollen grain has a complete male gametophyte. One nucleus in the pollen grain divides, forming the two sperm nuclei, and these guys here are going to be the pollen cones, and here's a better picture of the pollen cones, or you can look at it down here in this picture as well. The female cones, these seed cones are much larger, so that's, if you were thinking of a pine cone, they're all going to be females. Near the base of each scale of the seed are two ovules. The ovules, these are structures in which the female gametophytes develop, and the haploid cells are going to grow and divide to form female gametophytes, and they may have thousands of cells in the beginning. When fully grown, it's only going to have a few large egg cells ready to be fertilized. Now with pollination, the life cycle is going to begin when the male cone releases a large number of pollen grains carried by the wind. Some reach the female cone, which contains sticky scales to help the pollen adhere, and the grains are then going to be pulled inside toward the ovule. If the pollen grain lands near the ovule, the grain is going to split open and begin to grow a pollen tube, and that is going to connect itself to the ovule, and that's how the sperm will fertilize the egg. Fertilization produces a zygote, which is going to grow into a little embryo. So here we have it down here. You can see the seedling stage. The embryo is surrounded by a seed coat forming a seed, and the seed then falls to the ground or is carried by the wind, water, or animals to a new location to begin growing a new plant. And here we have the life cycle of a gymnosperm. So you have the mature sporophyte over here. You have the female cone and the male cone. They go through meiosis. We end up with your pollen grains, the ovules inside of the cone. They're going to meet up, and then they are going to begin producing this little baby pine tree. And that is where we will be stopping for today's class as far as this stuff is concerned. Tomorrow we're going to go over some taxonomy. Alrighty guys, I'll talk to you later.